All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, number 16, with my friend Justin Clark. How's it going?
Hi, Cory. It's going great. How are you?
I'm good.
16. Wow. What an incredible, we'll hit that 20 mark and it'll be awesome. That'll be sometime next year. I think 1, 2, maybe 19 or 20, something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, doing okay. We've just sort of been doing some chatting in the pregame about ways in which the sort of government has become increasingly more bureaucratized and corporatized as a way to move it away from doing what is in the public interest.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that, I think, ties in nicely to the book we'll be discussing tonight. So we've been doing books that are very heavy on theory, very heavy on history. This book, we're going back to sort of recent public policy. And the book we'll be talking about tonight will pick up very nicely from a previous episode, which is A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey. If you've not listened to that episode, I highly encourage people to pause this one, unless you're on the live stream, and then keep watching. But pause it and go listen to that episode and come back, because a lot of overlap will be with that episode and this one. So the book that we'll be talking about tonight is Broken. Not Broken. The book is called Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization by Grace Blakely. Grace Blakely is a journalist. She's an economic analyst and historian from England. She works for Tribune magazine, which is one of the major left publications over there in Great Britain. And she's also been a contributor to Novara Media, which is an awesome UK-based political channel and news outlet. I think Grace Blakely is absolutely amazing. I think she does an incredible job of making very complicated concepts about Marx and economics and history and making them very palatable to people. And Stolen is really no exception. Cool. And so the book really kind of picks up where David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism leaves off. And in fact, there's a certain amount of overlap. Okay. But yeah, so what the first thing that she really talks about is the way in which the changing dynamics of government post-World War II, which is what we've talked about before when we talked about David Harvey. So to just do a quick recap for folks, after World War II, the economies of Europe were completely ravaged because buildings were completely destroyed, millions had died because of the war, and the real the central player after World War II was the United States. The sort of imperial hegemon of Great Britain was it was waning, and the United States was becoming the emerging global sort of hegemonic power alongside the Soviet Union. And after World War II, it was in something instituted called the Bretton Woods system, which we talked about in the episode of David Harvey. The Bretton Woods system was developed by a variety of different economic players, including John Maynard Keynes, the English economist. And what the Bretton Woods system did was it created a certain level of economic development and control of the global economic system. So there were certain things that they instituted, like they instituted capital controls. So certain amounts of money can move from different countries at any given time. They instituted basically a global gold standard, with the United States dollar being the sort of global reserve currency backed by gold, and a slew of other sort of reforms that basically put limits on what the limits on what the global economic system could do. And not only was this a response to World War II, but was also a response to the Great Depression, because the Great Depression of the 1920s was largely caused by runaway financial speculation and sort of financialization. And that whole dynamic was kind of sunsetted by the Bretton Woods system. And that stayed in place for decades. But sort of in the background, as that's all going on, there's another development that's going on, which is the development of the sort of dominant ideological system of political economy that we live under today, which is neoliberalism. And we've talked about this before, obviously, in the Harvey episode. And one of the major components to neoliberalism was freeing up the economy so that we no longer had these capital controls. There was not controls on imports and exports. There was no backing of a currency by gold so that currencies could float with the market.
Right.
These were all kinds of reforms, and they were advocated for by an organization that was developed in the late 1940s, and it was sort of a parallel to the Bretton Woods convention that set up the Bretton Woods system, and it was called the Mont Pellerin Society.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, so the Mont Pellerin Society was developed in the late 1940s. It was based on meetings that a group of economists and political philosophers had in Mont Pellerin, France. And members of the Mont Pellerin Society included Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek, and Ludwig von Mises, sort of the big three of neoclassical economics. And so they began to set up the overarching paradigm that would develop post-1970s crisis. So Blakely's book covers a lot of this ground, very much like David Harvey's book does. But her focus is more on Britain. And she writes more about Britain than she does anything else because her book is English focused. It's British focused. But she does talk about the financialization in the United States as well and sort of globally. And so these organizations like the Mont Pellerin Society started to develop a completely different ideological architecture for their idea of how a global economy should work, which is, freer markets, free trade, free flows of capital and information.
Right.
That's what they wanted. And so that idea lay dormant for decades. And there was largely reasons for that. One was the Bretton Woods system was strong. It led to one of the greatest continued expansions of economic growth in human history between 1945 and 1970. Two was the development of the labor movement. The strength of the labor movement, both in the United States and in Great Britain, basically put a lot of these sort of reforms on the back burner because they would have hurt workers, and eventually they would hurt workers.
Right, of course.
And so throughout, the 50s and the 60s, the economy was doing great for most people. Now, of course, that leaves people out. And we've talked about that before, where it obviously left out people of color. It obviously left out women. There was, but there was real economic growth. There was real wage growth for most people within the economy, right? So, the economy and inequality went down during this period too. So the top 1% had a much smaller share of the global economy than they do today. And wages also kept up with productivity.
Right.
All of these things start to fall apart in the 1970s. And this is what we discussed in the Harvey episode. But before we get into that, I guess I'll kind of stop there and ask if you have any questions or comments about what we've discussed so far.
It's not necessarily directly related to what you've said, but it occurs to me that sometimes it seems like all of this capitalist structure is directed at hurting the very people who are creating the wealth.
Yep.
it's intentionally made to hurt workers, even though it relies on us.
Right. And the reason that it's developed this way is because, I think you've hit it on the head, but I'll add to that is that they do that because they know that workers who are united and have a sense of power and sort of institutional buy-in are much harder to break down.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened in the 1970s. For most of the 1970s, the labor movement was sort of at its apex in the sense that it had, especially in Britain, it had the most power that it ever had.
Right.
And in fact, I think it was the 1976 or 75 elections that happened in Britain, where they re-elected a Labour government, which there was two Labour prime ministers in the 60s and 70s. One was a guy named Ted Heath. The other one was a guy named James Callaghan. And Callaghan was the last Labour prime minister until the 90s. And then we'll get into why that's the case. But basically, they had this general election in the 1970s that said you can either side with labor, or you can either side with the unions, or you can side with the people. and the people chose the unions because ultimately they realized that the unions are them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But you're right. Like they know what buttons to push in certain inflection points, right? And there's a sort of aphorism that is attributed to Milton Friedman, which is that in times of crisis, political leaders will turn to whatever ideas are lying around.
Okay.
And especially like in the 1930s, when you had the crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, the ideas that were laying around at the time were Keynesianism, using huge amounts of government spending to prop up the economy. Those were the ideas that were laying around at the time, and public leaders took advantage of those, right? Well, in the 1970s, when the sort of crisis of capitalism really hits its peak in the developed world, especially the United States and Great Britain, the ideas that were really laying around that were different were the ideas of Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, which is neoliberalism. That was what was laying around. That was the different paradigm. And that was developed by over decades. It was well funded. It was well planned. They had a sense of understanding that there will come a crisis point where their ideas will be successful enough to be able to be implemented. And so that's what happens in the late 1970s. And there's really three things that happen back to back that completely change everything. And the first happens in 1978 in China. So in 1976, Mao Zedong dies.
Right.
And for the next 2 years, there is a power struggle that exists within the Chinese Communist Party. And it's between the Maoists, who believed more in government-owned enterprises and central economic planning, and what were known as the Dengists, who supported Deng Xiaoping, and the ideas of economic liberalization as a way of building socialism with what was called socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah.
This power struggle eventually resolves by 1978, and the Dengists win.
Yeah.
And Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1978. The very next year, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher is elected Prime Minister of Great Britain. And it's the first time that the Conservative Party had been in power for years. And they ran on a platform that kind of bifurcated the working class movement. And what it was really two things. One, we're going to break the miners, the coal miners, which were the strongest union in Great Britain. Thatcher and her allies knew that if they could break the coal miners, they could break any other union in the country.
Yeah.
And the second thing was expanding home ownership. And that was the way they were going to get people to buy in to economic reforms. Because if they had a sense of that, if they owned their home, that means they had property, which meant that they had a stake in the system. Mm. This is brilliant. Like, I cannot stress enough, conservatives are absolutely evil, but sometimes they're completely fucking brilliant. And
if only they put those that brilliance to actual humanitarian ends.
And like actually helping people. Yeah. So in Great Britain, post World War II, there was a substantial amount of public housing, what's called council housing. And what the economic reforms of Thatcher instituted were basically people's ability to buy their council homes over time. There was a large section of the public housing stock in Britain was something that people didn't own. You lived in it, and then if you moved out or if people died, then new people could move in. And that was decided by the local housing councils. That's why they're called council housing. And council housing still exists in Britain today. But it's nowhere near as much of a percentage of the housing stock as is privately owned housing or rentier. And there were controls in the amount of how much people would pay to live in these council housing.
Right.
So her reform was to turn these council houses over to the buying public and start selling them off. So people just started buying their homes. And if this sounds familiar, this is literally the same policy that George W. Bush would carry out 25 years later.
Okay.
In the mid-2000s. And we'll come back to why that's important. So you have Deng comes to power in 1978, Thatcher comes to power in 1979, and in 1980, Ronald Wilson Reagan is elected the 40th president of the United States.
Ugh.
So in the United States, there had been long-standing economic problems for a variety of reasons. One was the oil crisis. So the United States in the early 1970s faced an oil embargo that was instituted by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Mm-hmm. And what happened was the United States has supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War in the early 1970s. This pissed off the Arab world, which largely controlled the oil stock at the time.
Right.
Domestic oil production in the United States had begun to decline. 1970s is like pre-fracking technology, really pre-natural gas boom. So there were a lot of think pieces in the 1970s about, is this the end of oil? Like, will we run out of oil, and so on and so forth. So you have the oil crisis. There were gas lines everywhere. People had a really tough time getting gas. 2, there was inflation, which means that your money, your money goes a lot. It goes. Sorry, let me start that over. So there's inflation, and what that means is that your dollar goes a lot less far than it did before.
Right.
So a dollar is just worth fundamentally a lot less than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
So there was that, and then there was economic stagnation. The Bretton Woods system was starting to fall apart, and they fell apart for a variety of reasons. But the main thing that happened was in 1971, President Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard, pretty much blowing up the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah.
And with that, the Bretton Woods system began to completely fall apart, especially the control of the currency and the control of capital flows from different nations. So all this is going on at the same time. Reagan's elected in 1980, and he's elected on very much the same platform as Thatcher. But the main organization that he takes on is not the coal miners. It's the Air Traffic Controller Union. Yeah. And that happens in 1981 within months of him coming into office. And with Thatcher, it took her much longer to break the coal miners than it took for Reagan to break the air traffic controllers. He broke them within a matter of weeks. Right. It took Thatcher 4 or 5 years to really break the coal miners, but she eventually did. And the signal was basically that when the coal miners were broken, that the consensus was that if we try to fight back against the government's reforms, they will completely obliterate us. And that's exactly what happened. And so over the next 10 years, 20 years, you saw a variety of different things happening. You saw a large decline in union membership. You also saw a decline in real wages compared to based on productivity. And then you also saw a large decline in overall purchasing power by consumers. And this leads us to one of the hallmarks of neoliberalism. There's really one thing that makes neoliberalism work, and it's debt. Debt is what makes neoliberalism work. It helps to smooth over the deep structural contradictions within the capitalist system under neoliberalism.
Right.
And one of the ways it does that is through consumer goods. So as the United States and Great Britain started to make less and less and less, then the economy was built less on people making things or providing services and more on people buying stuff, on a consumer economy. And this stuff started to be made in other parts of the world. Part of it was made in Japan, but a lot of it started to be made in China. So China's economic reforms and their own neoliberalization under the Deng period had a direct connection to what was going on in the United States. Jimmy Carter, when he was president in the late 1970s, he was the one who formalized trade relations between China and the United States. Then they become and then we have what's called permanent normal trade relations, which is PNTR. That happened in 2001.
Right.
So again, I'm throwing a lot at you, but so does she. Like, Blakely is coming at you with a bunch of figures and a bunch of numbers. And what she's trying to articulate to you is that this was an era, the big takeaway is this is an era where the workers get fucked and their ability to purchase continually goes down. So in order to maintain their status, standard of living, they have to constantly do so with consumer debt. Consumer debt never used to be a large component of public life, either in Britain or in the United States, until the 1980s. And that's really the shift, where more and more people have consumer debt. And that can happen for a myriad of reasons. A lot of it is medical debt in the United States. Half of all personal bankruptcies in the United States are related to medical bills. It could be college educations, it could be housing, it could be consumer goods, it can be vacations, so on and so forth. Well, how are people fueling all of this debt? How are they able to have any kind of collateral to do that? You want to take a guess?
Their houses.
Bingo! That's exactly right. So this is exactly what they did. And this takes us up to about 2007, which is where David Harvey's book is over and leaves off, and this one picks up.
Okay.
So through the 90s and the 2000s, there was a huge shift in policies. So it was, the 1980s is really the beginning of neoliberalism as the global economic hegemonic sort of worldview. The 1990s is when it becomes permanent. So in the 1980s, it's when they start to build it. They kind of figure out the rules, right? And then the 1990s and early 2000s is when everything is systematized. And so really, the people who made neoliberalism more permanent were not Reagan and Thatcher. It was Tony Blair, the New Labour prime minister in the 90s from 1997 to 2007, and U.S. President Bill Clinton, who was president from 1993 to 2001. These two guys do for neoliberalism what Reagan and Thatcher could have never done, which is to make it permanent and convince people that it's actually progressive and good for them. Reagan and Thatcher never pretended to tell people that this was so much better. They knew that this was not great. And they had a pretty sociopathic view of the world. I mean, I think we talked about it in the David Harvey episode that one of Margaret Thatcher's most enduring quotes is that there is no such thing as society, only individuals. Now, that's the original quote. She had to roll back that quote. She had to take it back a little bit because there were people within her party who got pissed. So then she had to sort of retcon it and say there are only individuals and their families. She had to add the family part on it.
Of course.
But really, the real
gotta appeal to those social conservatives.
Right. Because here's the thing, right? Under neoliberalism, under capitalism in general, right? This goes back to Marx in the Manifesto, where he talks about all that is sacred, all that is solid melts into air, all that is sacred is profaned, right? That's what capitalism does. Capitalism destroys families. It destroys traditions. It destroys religion. It destroys, which is why a lot of atheists are hardcore libertarians, because they see the hardcore atheism match up very well with their sort of pro-capitalist anti-statism. Right. Which sounds like a contradiction in and of itself for most anarchists or people on the left, right?
Yes.
But there is that sort of whole development. So, capitalism is not very good at maintaining, human ties. It's not what it does. Right. But that's what Clinton and Blair really sold it on. Margaret Thatcher was asked once what her greatest achievement was, and she said, New Labour. It was the complete retrofitting of the Labour Party away from being a party of unions and the working class to a party that was focused on upper middle class professionals and financial interests. Yeah. It's a similar thing to the Democrats in the U.S., right? Same thing with the Democrats in the U.S., and I imagine it's the same thing for the Liberal Party in Canada. Yep. Yeah. So let's get. I guess it's. Yeah. I don't want to say it's too simple. Canada always had a farther left party, like we had. I can't remember this. I can't remember the initials of it, but before the NDP, there was a farther left party there too, and and in Britain, they never really had that. The Labour Party was the left party. Right. It existed as the left party. Now, there had always been more fringe parties like the U.S. Socialist Party or the U.S. Communist Party, the U.K. Communist Party. There had always been elements like that, but they were never a mainstay of electoral politics, right? But the Labour Party was. But the Labour Party itself had its own deep-seated problems. For example, the Labour Party of Great Britain was never explicitly Marxist, and it never had real Marxist commitments. It was always very much rooted in what was called Fabian socialism. And the Fabian socialists were people like Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells and others who sort of had a non-Marxist socialism. So it always had those problems. But anyway, so that was what she saw as her greatest achievement. And the Republicans in the United States could really see the new Democrats of Bill Clinton and their ilk as their greatest achievement. And if you really look at the Democratic Party today, it is essentially been sort of warped and contorted to the interests of capital. Now, the Democratic Party itself does not have a genuine working class origin in, say, the way that the Labor Party does. The Democratic Party was founded in the early 1800s by Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
You know, the Democratic Republican Party. That was the full name of it, right? But the Democratic Party was also the party of like slave owners and Ku Klux Klan members and Andrew Jackson, who orchestrated a genocide against Native Americans, the Trail of Death. Yeah. Like, the Democratic Party had always had those issues, but it sort of had a rebrand in the 1930s as the Party of Labor. Right. As a response to the growing populist and socialist and communist movements that were putting pressure on mainstream politics to change. And so let's get back to the early 2000s, right? Let's remember them, right? So the early 2000s, right? I was like a teenager. So
let's see, how old was I in 2000?
I was 10 years old in 2000. Okay.
I was 23 years old in the year 2000.
In 2000, okay. So I was 10. And so 2000, 2001 are very important. Especially also 1999. So there's something that happens in the United States that's very important. And what it is it's called the Graham-Bliley Act. Okay. I think there's one other name in it, but basically this was a financial deregulation bill that was passed in 1999. And what it did was it basically uprooted a cornerstone of New Deal era banking reforms, which was that before this act of 1999, during the New Deal, there was something passed called the Glass-Steagall Act. And what the Glass-Steagall Act did was it separated investment banking from commercial banking. So your local bank that held your mortgage could not sell your mortgage to a big financial firm in New York. Just couldn't do that. That was illegal. What the Graham-Bliley Act of 1999 did was it repealed Glass-Steagall. Yeah. Basically, it was one of the last major New Deal era banking regulations that it wiped out. Yeah. And signed by Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. And there was a U.S. senator who was also a Democrat from South Dakota named Byron Dorgan, who's radical, but he's like a populist Democrat. And one of the things that he said was when this bill was being considered on the floor of the Senate, he flat out said that if we pass this, we'll see a complete collapse of our financial system in 10 years. He was wrong.
It was faster than that.
It happened in 9. Yeah. So, but it was pretty goddamn prescient for him to say that because he was correct. So why did it collapse? Well, in a nutshell, what happened was that people bought homes. There was a huge housing boom that happened in the mid-2000s where housing went away from just being about, it had always been an issue of financial speculation and so on. But that was really only for the elite or the wealthy. Turning housing into sort of a financial instrument of growth was really only something that happened in the neoliberal era for the middle class or the working class, right? So this started in the Thatcher era in the 1980s where, you were encouraged to buy your homes, and then they used that as an electoral wedge that the Labor Party was going to take away your house and it created the sort of maker versus taker mentality that conservatives often have. Same thing happens in the United States, but it happens a few decades later. And so people started to take out loans that they couldn't afford. They were called ninja loans. No income, no job, no assets. That's what ninja stands for. And so people would buy these homes that were, $250,000 home, $500,000 home, and they wouldn't have any income, but they would do it anyway. They didn't have to account for their income because it was dirt cheap to get loans at that time, because the federal government here in the United States had encouraged home ownership. So it made the housing rules and the financialization rules much more lax. And so people could just get homes that they couldn't afford. Yeah. And people could say, you could blame that on the people who got the homes. No, it's not their fault. If you set up an incentive system, people will follow the incentives, right?
Yeah.
This was a policy choice that went awry. Well, what happened was that people kept buying homes. They would refinance their homes to take the equity out of their homes to continue their standard of living, right? So whether it was medical bills or vacations, consumer durables, like people, televisions, cars, whatever, and just overall, basic daily needs. People would use debt to do this.
This was, sorry to interrupt, but this was about the time when I recall, early 2000s was that it became popular to flip houses. There were people who it was their whole livelihood was to buy houses, furnish them or whatever, rebuild them inside, and then sell them at a higher cost. So it was it became, there were television shows about it. I don't know.
Oh yeah. And they're still on TV today, right? Because we're experiencing a same sort of housing bubble. It's not nearly as volatile as it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but it is, we live in one right now. Yeah. And so the bottom falls out of this in 2007. This is really where the beginnings of the cracks in the system start to happen. And what happens is people just can't pay their loans.
Yeah.
And so all of these loans, these home loans that had been taken out, these mortgages, they were broken up into financial instruments. Because again, all these banking regulations that were set up during the New Deal, they're all gone.
Yeah.
They're all gone. So you can kind of do whatever. So they turned these things into what were called mortgage-backed securities, or MBSs. So they would take a chunk of your loan, a financial institution would break that up into mortgage-backed securities, sell those off to institutions, and then people would continue to receive income from those mortgage-backed securities. The problem was that people stopped being able to pay for their fucking loans.
Yeah.
And the whole system falls apart. And it's very similar to what happened in the 1920s under the Great Depression. There was a speculative boom, and then there was a bust. Yeah. And then it was absolutely ravaged the economy. But what did our leaders at that time do in 2007, 2008? I think people, because of COVID and because of how bad the COVID crisis has been, people forget how awful 2007, 2008 really were.
Right.
And they were horrible. I mean, they were truly horrible. I mean, I saw my mother-in-law lose a third of her 401k in an afternoon.
Right.
I mean, it's terrible, right? And that's the best case scenario for some people. Other people, they were fucking homeless. They were kicked out of their homes. Yeah. Well, what happened? What did the federal government of the United States do? Did they help out homeowners? No. They helped out the banks. And in helping out the banks, they recognized that financialization ruled everything. That banking and finance began to control every aspect of people's lives. Because that's what neoliberalism is. It is the marketization and financialization of everything. And when I mean everything, I mean everything. Because that includes, that's the financialization of God. It's the financialization of sex. It's the financialization of family and tradition. And it's the financialization of the state itself. And so it's because capitalism, when it no longer has anything to conquer, begins to basically collapse in on itself and eat itself from the inside out. Which is what happened, right? With these, highly developed countries, imperialism, they had kind of gone all over the globe. They had conquered everywhere they want to. Now, what can these financial interests do? Well, they can start taking over the state itself, which is exactly what happened. And that's what Grace Blakely writes about in Stolen. She talks a lot about how the British government by the 1990s basically started to sell off huge chunks of public investments, whether it was infrastructure, technology, housing, whatever. They started selling it off to sort of the highest bidder. And you started to have things called PFI, which were private finance industries or private finance initiatives.
Okay.
This is how the English Channel, the channel that connects England to France, it was funded through a PFI contract.
Okay.
And what happens with PFI contracts is the argument for why we should do them is they always say they're more efficient, they save money, and they provide a better service. None of that is true. PFIs, what they actually do is they always go over budget. They're terribly inefficient, and they provide a completely shitty service. And so, and recently in Britain, with the privatization of some of the railroad systems, it got worse. Privatization is a big component of the neoliberal financial paradigm that we live under. And what it does is it's the financialization of the state, where you move away things from being about providing a good or service as a public good to providing a good and service for the public in the service of profit.
Yeah.
And the thing is that there are just certain things that are not designed to generate a profit.
Right.
And one of them is really like transportation and infrastructure. Infrastructure is not really made to generate a profit.
It's supposed to.
Yeah. That's why if you look at car-dependent societies like the United States and Canada, you look at why are the roads so bad? Mm-hmm. Well, the roads are bad for a reason, which is that it is literally financially unsustainable for local and county governments to be able to put in the infrastructure for car-dependent societies. Yeah. There's a book we might do next year or the year after, but I've been getting in and learning more about urban planning. I highly encourage people to check out the Not Just Bikes YouTube channel, which is awesome.
Cool.
He's a guy who was from Canada. He used to live in London, Ontario, Canada. And he moved to the Netherlands because he wanted to live in a society that was not completely and utterly car dependent.
Right. Okay.
And the problem with car dependency, and particularly car dependent suburbs, is that you literally cannot afford them. Most societies can't afford them. And what ends up really happening is the working class and the poor are basically underwriting the cost of these things for the middle class and the rich. Mm-hmm. So generally, like, people who are poor and live in cities who don't use cars, they don't own a car, they ride the bus or they ride a bike or they walk, but yet they're paying for, especially if they own a home, they're paying property taxes, which means they're paying for roads and all and so forth. But the return on investment for infrastructure is terrible.
Yeah, of course.
It's just terrible, like, in general. So you can't, in terms of profit, now in terms of how it generates like value in the economy, that's a different situation. But like in terms of generating a profit, it just doesn't do that.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because the way that you prop up these institutions is through debt. This whole thing runs on debt.
Yeah.
And as long as the debt is serviced, you're fine.
Right.
And what I mean by the debt being serviced is that people pay their mortgage, people pay their car payment, people pay their student loans, cities pay for they pay returns on municipal bonds and states and governments pay back on U.S. treasuries and so on. Like, as long as people can service the debt, you're fine. When people can no longer service the debt, the whole thing fucking collapses, which is what happened in 2008.
Right.
So this, literally, the model of neoliberalism itself is completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
And we've gone 40 minutes and I have not even talked about climate change. So that's...
Society is crumbling as we speak.
Right. So that's the fucking 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to neoliberalism, is that when you have the pursuit of profit at all costs, it also completely and utterly ravages the environment.
Yeah.
And it is going to be unsustainable for us to do any of this. And what is the neoliberal solution to climate change? What is it? It's market-based solutions. We just had COP26, right?
Right.
Or COP25, whatever it's called. The climate change conference.
Carbon credits, carbon taxes, this and that and the other. These things will not work. They won't work. And here's why they won't work. Because the incentive structure does not encourage people to do them, because they're going to lose more money on those boondoggles than they're going to make. And this goes back all the way to our first episode where we talked about Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. In that book, he comes up with an idea of like a carbon coin. And the reason that his system worked is because the incentive structure was different. Because if you have carbon credits, like, suck, because it's a bad short-term investment. Yeah.
The goal is to have a good long-term investment, but also have short-term returns. Like in the short term, you want to have some kind of return, but they don't really offer those under a sort of carbon credit system or carbon taxes, not to mention the fact that it's just unpopular. Like because the thing is about these kinds of models, the market-based solutions, what really ends up happening is that the poor and the working class underwrite the cost of the rich.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens when you institute reforms like taxes on things like fuel.
Yeah.
This is exactly what happened in France about a year or two ago, the Yellow Vest movement, right?
Yeah.
You saw massive amounts of working class people revolting against raising of fuel taxes.
Yeah.
Now, the raising of fuel taxes would be an important step in trying to get us to a carbon neutral future. The problem is that when it's implemented, it's done on an individual basis.
Yeah.
It's not done on a corporate basis, right?
Yeah.
What you need to do is have carbon taxes on corporations.
Yeah.
You need to make the incentive structure so that it's basically financially unsustainable for corporations to pollute, to extract fossil fuels from the ground, and to use fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I think it's like 100 companies around the world are accountable for like 71% of carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that, but it's some figure
Something
like that.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that U.S. military, right? The U.S. military is one of the largest polluters in the world.
Yeah.
We
had a yellow vest movement here as well, but it got kind of co-opted by oil companies, and it got co-opted by like white supremacists, basically. Anybody who was anti-immigrant was joining the yellow vest movement in Canada.
And the same thing happened in France because the sort of populism of the yellow vest movement had the same energies, right? Because there's a very large Muslim population in France.
Right.
And so the same energies are there. Because that's what happens, right? So in an economic system, when people don't look at it, say, the way that we do, right? Where we're leftists, you're an anarchist, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. Like, we have a theoretical framework by how we, for how we understand this stuff. And we acknowledge that it's not really like black versus white or gay versus straight or man versus woman. It's truly capital versus the workers.
Yeah.
That's the dichotomy,
which is
right?
Everyone except
which is everyone. If you don't own capital, you are a worker.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, here's the thing, right? Like, I have a home. Like, I'm a homeowner, but I don't own it yet because I'm paying a mortgage.
Right.
I won't own this house until I'm in my 60s. So but even then, it's a piece of property, but it's not capital.
Right. Yeah.
And people don't understand that distinction, that there's a distinction between personal property, the things that your stuff, and private property, which is capital.
Yeah.
Which is privatizing the means by which economic production is done. And then, you create a system in which people extract wealth and value from that simply by virtue of owning it.
Yeah. I was just talking to someone the other day, and like there was with the Cold War, it's been kind of propagated the whole time, and the main way, one of the main ways that it's been propagated is by telling people that if the communists win, they will take your stuff.
Yeah.
So,
yep. Well, and what's interesting about that is that home ownership is, especially among millennials, is substantially higher in China than it is in the United States.
Right.
So there's that. 1. 2, nearly everyone in Cuba owns their home.
Yeah.
Or if they don't, they pay less than 10% of their income. If they pay more than 10% of their income, it's illegal. Mm-hmm. And in Cuba, the cops actually enforce the rules for the working class rather than enforcing them for the elite. Like, that's the difference, right? And so like home ownership in socialist societies is generally far higher than it is in quote unquote capitalist free market societies. So that just puts that myth to bed. That's one metric. I'm not even talking about like stuff people own, like clothes, and
right? Yeah, obviously,
TVs or whatever. But long story short, so this is the shit. Now we know that we're in the shit. We're knee deep in it, or some people would say we're up to our eyeballs in this shit, right? So what are the solutions? How do we get out of this?
Yeah, the subtitle of the book is How to Save
how to save the world from financialization. So in the last part of the book, Blakely spends a great amount of time explaining how she would build a socialist system. And so her tendency is different than mine. So she identifies as a democratic socialist. So she's more of a reformist socialist type. Right. But I do think some of the ideas that she has in mind are really good. So one of them is what's called a people's asset manager. So what this would be a team of people within the government who help regulate public assets for the public good, instead of what we have now, which are like private asset managers who do it only in the pursuit of wealth extraction and profit. Yeah. So people's asset manager is great. More nationalization of industries, more publicly owned enterprises, the development of worker cooperatives, the development of public banking, and the institution of a more broad and robust public housing stock. So these are all of her reforms, right? The other thing is environmental sustainability. So it's about using public assets to reach certain carbon goals and move those over time. So again, her solutions are very simple. The only issue with them is that largely her solutions are top down. And and while they're good, her whole argument is that the way to have them not be so top down is by a real expansion and flourishing of democracy, which I think is great. Like the idea of really making our societies way more democratic than they are now, and having people have much more of a say. So like with the people's asset managers, like there would be people's like asset councils. There would be, housing councils like there are in the UK. There'd be housing councils everywhere. There would be banking councils. You would basically have some kind of council socialism where you would have democratic bodies locally helping make decisions locally, and then having essentially like party congresses where the country's representatives would meet and they would make decisions. The other thing is to combat imperialism. Right. So if we move our governmental model more towards meeting people's needs instead of wealth extraction from other parts of the globe. Because the real problem with sort of democratic socialism or reform socialism is that it's really built on imperialism if you don't put that in the forefront, right? Right. Like the Scandinavian socialism of like Finland or Sweden.
It's
like,
still very extractive.
It's very extractive, right? Yeah. Like it's an extractive model from the global south to the global north. So those things would have to be addressed. And that goes part and parcel with climate change as well. Yeah. So I think that it's essentially it's sort of republicizing things. It's taking things and putting them back in the public hands. And to know the popularity of this, when the Labour Party ran in, I think, 2017 under Corbyn, they did very well with this sort of platform that called for a lot of these reforms. And one was also the nationalization of the railroads. So the rail systems in Britain were largely privatized through the 90s and 2000s, and it led to widespread problems with them. They couldn't generate a profit, that they were inefficient, they didn't provide a good service, so on and so forth.
That's why we lost our buses here a few years ago because of the same situation. Like you can't travel on the bus from city to city anymore.
Yeah, right. And the thing is that like, especially like, I can't speak for your city specifically, but like we have a bus system here in Indianapolis, but it really only serves one function, which is to get cars off of the road. It doesn't really exist to provide robust public transportation for people. Yeah. Because the only people who would ride the Indigo bus system are like tourists or the poor. That's it. The people who cannot afford a car. People who could afford a car wouldn't go on the bus, and that's the real problem with car-dependent cities. And there's a book about this that we might do in a future episode called Strong Towns, which is by a guy named, I think his name's Charles Mahone, and he's an urban planner who recognized a lot of the problems with the urban planning of car-dependent societies and argued for a plan to get out of it. Because that's going to be the long-term thing. I mean, if we are serious about climate change, then one of the things we're going to need to do is move away from societies that are completely car dependent. I mean, we have to. And so to go back to Blakely's book, like the way you do that is through a real democratic renewal for socialism that prioritizes public goods over private profit.
Yeah, you have to really invest in public transit.
Yes, you have to invest in public transit, and that doesn't mean just the bus, right? Like,
no,
people say, "Oh, well, American cities were built for cars." No, they weren't. Most cities in the United States, most major cities, were built decades, if not centuries, before the introduction of the car.
Right. It's suburban areas outside of the cities.
It's the suburban areas. The cars as the only mode of transportation is something that was exclusive post-World War II.
Yeah.
And that's why there are certain communities, there's one in New Jersey and there's another one in Toronto, that they were communities that were built pre-World War II. They were built for streetcars, electric streetcars. And now the streetcars are gone, but the communities that supported them are still there. And they have sidewalks, they have businesses within them. Because one thing people don't realize is that in the United States, it's largely illegal to build a residential property in a business zone.
Yeah.
And vice versa. So, and Canada's the same way. And so there are communities in older parts of where I live in Indianapolis where there are like liquor stores or corner stores in neighborhoods. But those existed and were grandfathered into current zoning laws. So now it's almost impossible to do any of that now, which is why in order for you to get anything, whether it's groceries or eating out or buying clothes or doing anything, you have to drive.
Yeah.
Because the residential and the commercial are not the same place. And so that's another issue. And it's exacerbated by the sort of neoliberal model, which is to atomize everyone, to split up everyone, and to not create a sense of community. Because if you create a sense of community in people, and people have real, genuine commitments, whether it's political commitments, religious commitments, cultural commitments with other people, then they don't buy as much shit. They're not interested in it.
Yeah.
They're not interested in having all the fancy ass crap because they have genuine human connection with other human beings. And that's the kind of world I want to live in. One where not only is the air clean and the water is drinkable and that, the bank and the banks and capital doesn't control everything, but also a world where we can make real genuine human connections. Because under financialization, we just can't do that.
No,
because under neoliberalism, everyone is seen as the individual rational actor.
Yeah.
Neoliberalism treats us as if we're computers. And the whole point of socialism is to reintroduce humanity to itself. And you have to reintroduce that sense of humanness because the world we live in completely strips and rips humanity out of it. And so that's why, and this is a bit of a tangent, but it's important because this is something we'll talk about next time when we talk about Christopher Lasch, is that the people who argue, oh, if people could just be more rational, everything would be better. That's not true. It's just fundamentally not true because we live in one of the most rational systems in the world, neoliberalism, and its consequences are insanely irrational and harmful, not just to individuals, but to the fucking planet. Yeah. So this idea that, if people were just more reasonable, we'd be better off. Like, that's not true. And the implementation of financialization that is chronicled by Grace Blakely's book goes to show you that that's not true.
Yeah.
And it's using rational means for deeply irrational ends, which is the pursuit of profit extraction above all else. And we have to move away from that, or we could very well face the extinction of the human race. So I think the question is not, the phrase used to be socialism or barbarism. The real phrase now is socialism or extinction.
Yeah.
And it's really like, that's the choice. And so I want to end on a hopeful note because I am generally an optimist. And the way that we do that is by building real, tangible working class movements that fight for immediate reforms that will help people in the short term, and then the long-term goal of societal transformation or revolution. So with that in mind, I highly recommend people check out Grace Blakely's book. It's awesome. You can also check it out on audio. She reads it.
Cool.
She has a cool British voice, so it's fun to listen to her talk. And check out her other writing. She writes for Tribune Magazine. She's done stuff with Novara Media, and she's got a podcast too, which is called A World to Win, which is the line from the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah. I think you've talked about that before, and I might even have subscribed to it.
Yeah, World to Win is great, and I highly recommend people check her out. We do have ideological differences, but I do really think she's one of the best people to go to get a Marxist perspective on economics in this current era.
Cool. So, we're covering Christopher Lasch next time?
Yes. So the next time we'll be covering Christopher Lasch, who was a historian, cultural historian and cultural critic. And he will be covering his 1984 book, The Minimal Self, Psychic Survival in Troubled Times. And we're going to be talking about Marx. We're going to be talking about Freud. And we're going to be talking about narcissism, because Lasch is best known for his other book, The Culture of Narcissism. So that's what we'll be talking about next time. And then we'll be finishing out the year talking about China. We're going to read Mao, and we're going to read another book about modern China and its economy.
Cool. So where can people find your stuff?
People can find my stuff at justinclark.org. The latest episode of Red Reviews is now available on the website, all about our episode on the Russian Revolution. And people can follow me on Instagram at JustinClarkPH for public history. And my newest article is now available on my website, which is the friendship between Robert Ingersoll, the late 19th century free thought order, and Eugene V. Debs, the American socialist leader. That was published by the Truth Seeker magazine. And you can check that out on my website. And then I always encourage people to follow Cory on Patreon. Was it patreon.com/skepticalleftist?
That's right.
All right. So definitely become a patron. I highly encourage people to do that. Cory does an incredible amount of hard work on this show. And I really appreciate him providing me this platform. And then just one last thing. I'm also a part of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or PSL. We're a Marxist-Leninist party based out of the United States, but we have members all over the country and all over the world. And we're genuinely committed to working class revolution. And if you're interested in learning more about the PSL, you can check us out at pslweb.org.
Cool. Well, I think that's everything for this afternoon. I was going to say this evening, but it's afternoon. So
this is one of the early ones. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Justin.
Thank you.
All right. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. I want to say thank you again to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many gig hours. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then you can check out the show notes or check my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, From Many People's Strength, which is a show about Saskatchewan politics, and a new project I'm involved in that's called the Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries with my friend Damien Marie at Hope. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request, which is facebook.com/cjbrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which you can find on my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's just all try to be kind to other leftists and to all people. And even if we think they're wrong, The battle that we are fighting is an uphill one and has many obstacles, and we will need all the comrades we can get.
Yeah, no, we have the same issue with this company that we financed some work on our basement with, where basically like every month the minimum payment would come out or whatever as it's supposed to. And then it would say, you still have money owed. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And it was like 3 pennies. And then I thought that they were like charging me some kind of fee afterward, because the way my finance company worked is that instead of the interest on the loan being built into the overall like balance, they separate out each charge of interest per month. It's very strange. It's very weird.
Yeah,
but it's typical of that kind of bullshit.
Yeah, for sure. Like I don't know what it is. Like they just typically do whatever they can to manipulate the numbers and the system so they can make more, right?
Yep.
And meanwhile, yeah, we're over here trying to just give them our basic payments, and yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. They're all fucking thieves.
Yep, exactly.